Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Lee McWhorter, cybersecurity instructor for WazU. Welcome back to the third lecture workshop on the Security Foundations class that began a couple weeks ago and wraps up this Sunday. We have already covered the first 7 lessons in our usual format, as I described the first week. We usually cover the first 3 in the first week, and then the 4 lessons last week, getting through lesson 7, the first of the security frameworks lessons, and where we dove into very important security framework, and one that almost every organization has to take into account, that being the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry's Digital Security Standard. So this week we have to get through our last 3 lessons, and so we're going to pick up where we left off in lesson 8, which is imaginatively called Security Frameworks 2. And so if you remember, we talked last week. Security frameworks, I like to tell people and keep in mind that they're kind of like blueprints and templates. You know, we use the analogy, you wouldn't just go off and start building your house. You would no doubt, want to take a look at what other people had done, look at some other blueprints online, get some ideas, maybe say, I really love this kitchen, I really love this layout of the master bedroom, and build your own dream home, right? Well, in cybersecurity, when we're working on helping an organization create their security posture and set up all their policies and procedures and principles, we don't have to start from scratch either. Not only is it very likely that you'll go work someplace that already has a basic security policy and procedures in place, but you still might have to update it once in a while. And if you do happen to go work for a startup or start your own company and have to start from scratch, you don't. Instead, you're going to want to look at these various security frameworks and these different organizations that put these out. And so we spent a lot of time last week talking about PCI DSS. And as part of your assignments, you had to spend some time over on that site doing a little research, finding out more about that standard and some of the things that they recommend. If you remember, I mentioned that I really consider the PCI DSS, the domains of it, to be the barest minimum security policy and procedures an organization needs. And in effect, that's what they do as well. They consider that if you're going to process credit cards, you need to make sure you follow these certain rules and you take these certain actions, including, like we talked about, having separate accounts for people who access that credit card data for auditability, having things like security awareness training and regular testing and vulnerability and pen test scanning as part of your routine, etc. So in 8, we talk about the alphabet soup that is all the other agencies and non-governmental entities and associations that are out there that provide additional security frameworks for us to look at. So one of the big ones is the organization that is actually just referred to by its initials, or it's called ISO. Most people think of that as the International Standards Organization, but officially its name is ISO. And they put out a series of guidelines and recommendations that deal with cybersecurity on an international basis. And that's part of their 27002 specifically ISO. And they also do that in partnership with one of the other groups, lots of acronyms, but IEC. You'll also find that there are in this lesson and out there in the world, there are many national organizations. So we have a wonderful one in the States called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And so these people and those organizations are charged with providing standards for us. So they're the folks that run like the atomic clocks that keep everything running on time, and all of our phones and modern enterprise networks using time servers stay in sync. They also put out standards on what is a pound, what is an inch. I mean, all kinds of standards and technologies. But they, of course, also delve into very deeply into a lot of standards related to cybersecurity and the manufacturing and the various other aspects of technology. And they have basically the NIST 800 series of documents. And so one of the things I was going to do, I just is sort of a little show and tell, is I'm going to share my screen. I've brought up that website just by searching on NIST. Let me just bring it up here. So I searched on NIST 800, and this is one specific sub-piece of it, the 800-53 special publication that they put out. It's all part of their Information Technology Laboratory and the National Vulnerability Database. And you'll see that it says that this NIST Special Publication 853 is a database that represents various security controls. And we're going to talk more about those later, and we've mentioned that word before. and associated assessment procedures that are defined for federal systems that are information systems and organizations. And so obviously federal government organizations and agencies have to follow this. Contractors to those organizations need to follow this. And so the first page is mainly just an index talking about a number of things that you can download, including pulling down the entire list of controls via an XML file, but we also have them kind of broken out. And so I'm just going to do a quick tour here. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But if we go down and look at their low impact controls, there's all these different controls. So what is a control? We're going to talk about it more in lesson 10 as we wrap up today. But anytime in cybersecurity that we put something into place to attempt to protect, to perform our mission, to protect that core information at the core of the organization and all the digital assets that surround it, then we are putting in place a control. So here's a perfect example: unsuccessful login attempts. So this would be the NIST recommendations on how you set this up. Enforce a limit, enforce some kind of limit, right? So don't just let people log in again and again and again, and automatically lock accounts when they are attempts, multiple attempts to fail. So this is a guideline. This, you don't use this necessarily just completely word for word, but you are going to need to have your own policy in your organization of how many times are you going to allow somebody to log in, and what happens when those attempts, multiple failure attempts happen to you. And then this standard is to have a limit that you enforce, and then you lock the account if that limit is exceeded. And so they're just examples of, remote access controls, wireless controls, all these different things. And as I said last week, when it comes to these security frameworks, what we're wanting to do is go out there and look at all the different bodies, all the different organizations that have some impact on our life. The national standards bodies like NIST and the European equivalent, the Japanese, Chinese, other people's equivalent organizations are great to look at. The ISO standards are great to look at. And as we're going to continue to see as we talk on, there are a number of other industry associations that have also put out guidelines, much like PCI DSS has. And so you're going to want to look at multiple of these and many times merge and take some of the elements from one. So maybe you like this control. Yes, we're going to do this. We're going to follow the NIST standard for our login attempts. We're going to set up 3 login attempt and a lockout if that's exceeded. Maybe we like their remote access controls. We like some of their others, but then some of the other guideline bodies out there, some of these other frameworks, maybe we like certain elements of theirs. And you want to look around at multiple, not only because they're all trying to bring together best practices across multiple industries, but you want to look sometimes at the industry association's guidelines, because if you're in that industry, then you're going to be benefiting from the best practices that have been brought together by that organization to put those standards out. Generally speaking, as I say, you want to make sure you obviously cover anything you're obligated to cover, anything you're regulatorily required to cover. So if you process credit cards, you're definitely going to look at the PCI DSS controls, and you're going to look at what you have to do minimum to stay PCI DSS compliant. If you're a contractor for the government, then you're going to definitely want to take into account various controls from NIST. If you're a contractor for the military, you're going to look at the DoD recommendations and guidelines. They have their own as well. Even though you may just be a US-based company, if you have a website and you could theoretically get customers from other places, then you're going to want to look at other examples. And you may want to anyway, even if you're a U.S. corporation that for however you're doing it, maybe you're still bricks and mortar kind of stores, that people have to be in the States to come buy from you. You don't have an e-commerce website. That doesn't mean you wouldn't look at the European or the Chinese or other standards and take, once again, some of the best ideas, some of the best practices and incorporate them into yours. It's not, some companies will just take one set and try to follow it, but most of the time the value comes from, just like if you're building that house or you're writing that resume, you're not just going to look at one, you're going to look at multiple houses and take ideas from each one to build your dream house. You're going to look at multiple resumes and you say, okay, I like the way this person showed their skills. I love the way they did their jobs here. And I'm going to produce my own resume that meets my needs. And that's what an organizational cybersecurity team has to do when helping to develop, or as I've mentioned, we don't Thankfully, most people have at least a baseline in their organization if they already exist. And of course, the major companies do. But periodically, these need to be updated. And this whole process kind of needs to be gone through again, where we take a look at what we have. Okay, we are using these rules and these controls, but hey, maybe we've merged with the company. And so we need to take a look and make sure they're in different lines of business. Are we following all the requirements that we need to for those industries? Oh, well, while we were a US company and we never had any foreign customers unless they were tourists, this company that we merged with has a website and we have lots of company customers coming in from Europe. Well, then we better take a look at the European standards, and particularly some of the new standards like the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, that they put out a couple years ago and went into force last year. Those are changing and having huge impact. As a matter of fact, it's actually one of the things that, if you remember, most of you will probably remember this because almost all of us are signed up to 1,000 different things, the various social media sites, various other entities and companies we may do business with, streaming sites, e-commerce sites, etc. Last year or so, you probably, like me, got barraged by a bunch of emails from Facebook and Twitter and different folks. And they were saying, we've updated our terms of service, we've improved our privacy, we've done whatever. And many times they're pitching it as, this is a great thing we're giving to you. We did this to make it easier for you. But if you really dig down behind the scenes, one of the reasons that a lot of that happened last year was because of the European GDPR regulations. They are very intense regulations on privacy and data protection. There are much more onerous rules now on disclosure of what information you're gathering, say like Facebook or other sites, from a website when you visit, what's being used, how that information is being used, the right to be forgotten, the ability for technically a customer to say, hey, yeah, I used you last year, you got some of my data, but I now want you to delete it. And you have to be compliant with those if you're serving European customers. And so there's an interesting story here, though, if you look at how some of the major players dealt with GDPR. In the case of Facebook, Facebook decided that it did not want to implement GDPR, in other words, the European standards, all over the world. And so last year, it split itself in a way, at least, kind of corporately. And all of the Europeans, all people that live in European countries, they are now managed and dealt with, if you will, underneath Facebook Ireland, because Ireland is an EU country. And those people have all the rights and protections, and they have to follow all the rules related to GDPR for those individuals. But they did not choose to implement that worldwide. They only implemented it for Europe. And everybody else in the world, the United States, China, Asia, Africa, Middle East, everybody else is all being run out of Facebook US and the rules and privacy policies that are applied there. So they chose to have two different sets, in a sense, of security frameworks, one for their European customers and one for not. Twitter, on the other hand, did exactly the opposite. Twitter decided that's going to be too much of a pain. We are not going to separate and segment our user body. People who use Twitter are all going to get the same. And so we're going to implement GDPR levels of rights and privacy rights and protections and controls within our system and be compliant for all users, whether they're European users or not. So you can see that two different companies, two major social media companies, decided to react to a requirement, a new security framework, a new guideline document, in two distinctly different ways. And ultimately, that's how every organization has to go through the process. You're going to go through, as part of, if you're tasked to be part of the cybersecurity team that is, updating more likely, or maybe if it's a new company, creating the cybersecurity posture, all the policies and procedures and frameworks and guidelines that go together to protect your organization, then you're going to want to go out and look at PCI DSS, look at NIST, look at ISO, look at, anything regulatory. Oh, we have European customers. We got to make sure we take into account GDPR. Oh, we do some financial, not just credit card, but we're a bank, or we're, whatever. We somehow fall under like Sarbanes-Oakley or other requirements that are out there. We work for a subcontractor of another contractor who has a military contract. Well, we better look at the DoD specs and make sure that we are following all those and we're putting those levels of protections of our network and our information in place. So the security frameworks, like I said, the best analogy is to sort of think of them as proposed blueprints to how to build your own cybersecurity policy and all your procedures and guidelines that go with that. And they also vary not only by coverage and by industry and things like that, but by what they provide. We saw on the NIST site there, they were giving you example controls. Okay, we recommend that for login, you have a limited number of attempts and then a lockout. For other things, here's our recommended for, remote access or wireless, etc. And obviously you can look at those and incorporate those into your security policies. But many of these groups and organizations, all this alphabet soup that is Lesson 8, the Corbett Group and some of the other industry groups like ISA and IEC, which are electrical engineering and information systems associations, these groups, sometimes they actually not only propose, sort of the guideline for what your control or your rule should be, but they may have other resources to help you in the process of setting up your cybersecurity policy. They may have checklists. They may have templates. They many times have like a draft acceptable use policy, a draft password policy. They've not just, you ought to do these things, but they've written it out, and you could, modify it as you want and use it. They may have a checklist to make sure you can go through and check, are we doing all these things? They may have other types of documentation, spreadsheets, PDFs, templates that are up on their sites that you can pull down and then reuse these to help your organization produce their own security policy. So security frameworks, like I said, are the blueprints that help us create these security policies and make sure we've taken into account, we're not just winging it. We're not just making it up as we go along. We're able to take advantage of the fact that these governmental and intergovernmental and industry associations have brought together these best practices and these sets of recommendations for us so that we can make sure we're at least, checking the minimal boxes. And ideally, by going through the process of using multiple of them, sort of taking the best of each and building your own, you will have built a policy and procedure set that helps your organization maintain security as best as possible. So you will go through a number of these. You need to know NIST and ISO and things like that, not only because they're important and the odds are you'll have to look at their sites again and you go work for a company that's using a large part of their guidelines and as part of their security. But the other thing is don't forget, of course, the Security Plus exam. All of those, the main ones and the big entities, the big national ones and international ones, are potentially questions on the at least who they are and knowing what security controls and frameworks are. So that wraps up that sort of middle section there of some of the basic defense principles that we covered, and then the two lessons on security frameworks. And so we now move into lesson 9. Now, we already had a lesson, one of the very first lessons. We talked about it the first week on threat actors. And so here we are returning to threat actors again. Well, in the first week, we just kind of high level defined threat actors, right? The amateurs, as I joke, every year at Christmas, a new crop is born as people, a certain percentage of the kids who get new computers decide they want to be hackers, and they go off and download some tool and they start trying to take out their friend's Minecraft server or knock them offline when they're playing Fortnite, whatever they're doing. And, so we call them script kiddies because they're just doing the very basic things. They don't understand everything that's going on. And most of the time it's automatic attack tools. They've downloaded a copy of Kali and starting to play with things. And so then, of course, as we step up the line, we get into the criminal hackers, we get into all the way up to the nation state players, and we have a few other categories like hacktivists and others along the way. So we define those. But in this lesson, we do go a little deeper into these threat actors because we want to, and it kind of follows the progression of their experience, but not always. But it's important to understand a little bit more about, some more detail about your players. The amateurs are probably the easiest one, the script kiddies to get. They can be any age really, but I joke that, that's true. And I have literally seen this in my logs for 20, 30 years of running servers on the internet. Every Christmas, there'll be a slight spike in the number of attacks that I see because, as I said, a new crop of hackers has been born. But what happens is a certain percentage of those people get bored with it, like any game or anything else they're doing, and they return to social media and playing Fortnite and doing whatever else they're doing. Some get in trouble, maybe get caught, and then of course some start to realize, hey, I could get in trouble here, but I'm interested. I want to keep learning this. And maybe they join the Cyber Patriot program in school. They, start getting involved with the local security meetups, following people on Twitter, joining a program like ours to become a white hat hacker and to be one of the good guys and girls that helps defend the networks. But of course, a certain percentage continues on. They actually take over a machine because people do stupid stuff like leave default passwords. So that script kiddie got lucky. They attacked a certain range and oh my gosh, they're in. So now they have a server. And if they keep going down the dark side, they keep going down the black hat hacker right, then what are they gonna do with that? Well, they're gonna use that resource now to cover their tracks and attack another. And slowly but surely, they begin to build up some resources. They have a small botnet, for example. They've taken over dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of machines out there. And now they're using it to send spam, to further attacks, to obfuscate where they're coming from, route their, proxy their traffic through so they can hide. So they're moving up in sophistication, in knowledge, and in resources because they are using yours. If they've taken over your computer, then they may be sending spam or their next phishing attack or whatever. And of course, then as that continues to grow, one of the things we've really seen in the last number of years is the growth of what I would call cyber criminal syndicates. And there is a whole underground economy, the dark web, as it's referred to, and a whole series of players that ultimately there's a marketplace and there's companies. And very much that's, as is the criminal hackers get better and better and they start to come together in one way, shape, or form. It may be a situation of just, one person finds an exploit. They develop a new tool and they try to go out and sell it to other hackers to use for whatever their means are. Or they get together and they actually start working together. One of the most fascinating stories that I read over the last couple of years was a group of very sophisticated criminal hackers that they had managed to gain access to the sites that manage press releases. If you're not aware of how that works, companies, of course, need to put out a press release. They're going to merge with somebody. They've got a clinical trial that's coming out. They need to release the results. But because of various rules, especially if they're a publicly traded company, they have to avoid insider trading. Somebody's got to write that press release and get it all written and proofed and ready to go, but many days before it's going to be officially announced, right? And so they will use a company like PRWire or others out there, and they will submit that press release to them, and it will be put in digital escrow so that it can't be released until midnight or noon or whatever day. So that Monday we're going to make the announcement of the merger, then that press release will go out to the internet. But we may have submitted it the previous Thursday after everybody in marketing has, approved the message and now it's ready to go. Well, these hackers had gotten into, and I'm not saying which companies, but people like that. And from my understanding was from multiple of them. So they had broken into 2 or 3 of the major press release sites on the internet and news organizations that hold these. And thus they were able to see what was about to be released next week, a week from now, 2 days from now, whatever. And so, of course, this is insider information at its purest. And so then they worked with some, not so ethical brokers and stockbrokers around the world. And this was a globe spanning operation. And they worked a deal. Hey, we know these secrets. And if you trade on this, you probably make some money. We want a piece of it. And so your, percentage of the action, and these brokers would pay then to get access to that press release data. And so here's a very sophisticated organization that is, 2 or 3 people as a little company. And then it even got bigger. Like they started to make a lot of money. They had dozens of people, illegally using this insider information to trade on their own accounts. They were, of course, making money because if the release was going to come out and say that some drug was coming positively going to be approved, that's going to take the stock price up, right? So they'd buy the stock, wait till the announcement, sell it, make their money. Or if it's the opposite, they could short the stock. That's a financial move of saying, I want to sell it today for this money and I'll buy it back later when it collapses. So they were making money and sharing this with the hackers. Millions of dollars were being made. And the companies kind of finally figured out, oh my gosh, there's somebody in our systems, and they shut the door. And now this is a very lucrative business. So the hackers who'd originally broken in they went out and hired more hackers to help them get past the new defenses and managed to break back in and continue this game for a while longer. A fascinating example of a criminal organization with serious resources and skills and the ability to, with salaries and money and budgets and profit, to go out and hire other people to continue their nefarious activities. So, and of course, as you get up to the highest level of the criminal organizations, and then you start to get into the, somewhat paralleling at the level of the most highest levels of sophistication and access to resources, you start to get to those very high in criminal organizations or to the nation state players. Every country in the world has groups of people that they have hired and trained to be cyber defense or cyber attack. Many organizations, probably most countries, I shouldn't say organizations, but most countries not only have their official ones, like in the United States, we have numerous people who work for the military or work for the NSA or work for the CIA or FBI, and they're cybersecurity professionals. You could go work for one of them. But we might, in lots of countries out there, have sort of quasi-independent groups. They're supposedly independent groups, but they're really kind of under the table being supported or backed. Well, these are, once again, very sophisticated adversaries. We even have that phrase I mentioned a couple weeks ago, APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, for these folks. They can get in and stay in for a long time. And their goal is not just to get in like some amateur and throw their logo on the website or go in and steal a list and instantly sell it. They want to get in and stay in and still trade secrets and be able to have that foothold. So it's important to understand this gradation, not only of experience, but of resources and motivations and all the things that we cover in this lesson, because it is all part of what this whole first lesson is about. Introduction to cybersecurity, understanding. We have to know our enemy, right? And we have to know it for our organization. So we have to think of it like, if we could be a multi-million-dollar company, but if we're a rug wholesaler in the middle of heartland America, and we're selling to so many carpet and rug companies or in various other retail companies, then are we going to be attacked by a nation state player from China, Russia, Iran, or someplace? Probably not. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. Maybe the owner of one of your businesses is actually a front and there's some reason, but for the most part. Now, it doesn't mean you don't do anything about it. You say, oh, never have to worry about them, but it's all about the rating of things. If your biggest threat is criminal hackers, or your biggest threat because you're a defense contractor is nation state players, then that affects how you're going to put into place defenses. As I've used, I think earlier in this example, and is one I use quite often, each organization, is different, even if they're in the same industry or they kind of do the same kind of thing. So you could take two different companies that both have e-commerce, for example, is a quick, easy example. One of them is Amazon-like and makes a gazillion dollars a second from their e-commerce. And then one of them is Lee's Pizza. I get a few orders to do delivery in the evening hours. My website goes down. Am I going to, because I got a store and I have customers that come in all the time. It's extra money. It's nice. It's maybe embarrassing if my website gets hacked. But, it's not going to be China who hacks Lee's Pizza. Now, China might want Amazon, or Russia or whoever, because of all the sheer amount of data that they could gain from getting in there, right? So each organization has to do their own analysis and look at, and understand what the threat landscape is for them, because that's going to provide insight into what level of protection. Amazon will spend millions of dollars a day to try to defend their major network, even keeping aside Amazon Web Services, just their own website, because millions and millions of people worldwide use it. There's so much data in there, so much money flows through there. That's a promising target to a high-end criminal organization potentially, or a nation-state player to gain just sheer access to information. Lee's Pizza, on the other hand, yes, there are smaller tier criminal organizations that would love to get in there and be able to steal my money or steal the credit card information on my customers that are ordering online, so they can do identity theft and try to rip them off, etc. But the level of sophistication that we're both going to face is likely substantially different. And just the total analysis of the situation, they make a lot more money and I make a few bucks a night, so I can't spend millions of dollars to defend that. My controls to protect my website are going to be more basic. I'm going to definitely make sure I got a backup. So if somebody does get in and throw their Guy Fawkes mask on my website, then I can, restore and get back up and running. Going to put certain controls in following PCI DSS because I am taking credit card where I'm encrypting that. I'm probably not storing that, definitely not on the website. I'm just letting the order process. If the order is approved, then I ship it off to you and the banks handle the money, gets in my account, I'm happy. I don't necessarily want to store that, but if I do, then that adds more complication. So every organization has to kind of do its own, and we have to keep into account what our potential adversaries are. So we spend a little time in this lesson digging deeper into that. And then the big thing we really add is something that is new. In the first time we talked about threat actors, script kiddies and criminals and nation state players, etc. We didn't talk about really a very important, hugely important, and in some cases more likely to be important than, say, a major hack, is the concept of what we call non-human threat actors. Now, remember, back to week 1, what is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is the protection of the digital information at the heart of any organization. That information they need to keep secret, from employee records to customer records to source code to proprietary price lists to on and on. Everybody has something in an organizational context that they need to or are required to keep secret. And then we also have to protect all the digital assets around that, the computers and servers and networks and things that are processing and storing and transmitting that data. That is what cybersecurity is about. That is our space. That's our bailiwick. We go in and protect that data and all the stuff around it. And remember, we have 3 promises we make, in effect, as I like to refer to them. The CIA triad, right? Confidentiality. Everybody gets that. We're kind of keeping that secret. Integrity. We don't want that data to change in a way that we can't control. We don't want the war games where the kid hacks in and changes his grade from a C to an A. That's an integrity violation. We don't want somebody to hack in and change balances or change other information, right? Inject something into our source code. So that we get those. But then there's that last one. I always say, don't forget the A. Don't forget availability. Our job is not just to lock everything down and throw it back behind the volcano and and hide it somewhere secret. We could do that and no one would ever get in. But then neither do our salespeople, neither do our accounting people, neither do anybody. We have to make it available to the organization so the organization can accomplish its objectives. So we can't get so focused on hackers, breakers, and bots and viruses and forget about power outages, hurricanes, earthquakes, wherever. Once again, every organization is different. But if your organization is based or has a data center or an office in Florida and you don't have, as part of your cybersecurity plan, hurricanes, then you're failing your company. If you have an organization out in California and you don't have earthquakes as part of your plan, how are you going to deal if that happens? I'm not even talking the big one. I'm just saying it happens. If you're down for a period of time because your data center is down and you don't have a remote facility, a hotspot, or some other form of backup and protection, what happens to your company? Big companies can survive a downage. They've got lots of money in the bank, they can deal. Small companies like Lee's Pizza, I go so many days and my business is down and my technology is down and I can't process orders, I can't pay bills, I can't order supplies so that when we come back up and working, I have fresh stuff. And all of a sudden I'm really now closed for weeks. I run out of business, I run out of money, and very likely have to shut down. So we talk a great deal in lesson 9 about non-human threat actors, all of those things that basically insurance companies like to refer to as an act of God, things you don't really control. You can't control the hurricane coming. You can't control the earthquake. You can't control that a war breaks out in a country where you have a manufacturing facility or you have a major operation, mining or something. But you have to take those things into account and plan for them so that we can maintain the availability of the data and information that the organization needs to survive and to conduct its business. If the data isn't available and the salespeople can't get into the sales list, they can't call the next lead, they can't make any money. If we don't have a way to pull up customer records so that we can deal with support and process bills and invoices and payments, we can be dead in the water. And ultimately, we can sadly be part of the contributing factors that kill a company off. So lesson 9 goes into great detail of that. And it actually then nicely dovetails into what we're going to start talking about in our last lesson today, lesson 10. Lesson 10 is called Organizational Security Basics. And in a way, I look at it very much as it kind of wraps everything we've learned from this course together. We learned in the beginning what cybersecurity is. We learned about the CIA tribe. We talked about attackers. Now we talked a little bit more about them, including non-human. We talked about some of the roles of people who play in our field and how what they do to protect and help and defend and maintain those three promises. We talked about very important defense concepts that are going to come back again and again and again throughout the program, throughout your life, throughout Security Plus exam, throughout everything. Defense in depth, rotation of duties, simplicity, obscurity, access, limiting access, all these important basic concepts that apply again and again as we try to put into place the procedures and policies that are going to protect and carry out our job in cybersecurity. And as I said earlier, when we were talking about the frameworks, and we go into great detail in lesson 10, the first thing we start in lesson 10 is with the concept of controls. Anytime we put something into place, we say, okay, here's an acceptable use policy. You can or can't do these things on our systems. That is a control. We're trying to control the situation, right? We're making the employee sign on that dotted line as they're part of their onboarding that they can't go to Facebook on the work computers, or they can, but only during lunch hours, or whatever the rules are. And in many cases, we're putting these in, right, to protect the information. We don't want them going to places that, might expose them to some kind of thing like a Facebook, bug or a virus or, something that's being distributed. Because if it gets into our system, then it can, obviously defeat our security, open up a back door potentially. So the lesson talks about not specific controls like we looked at a minute ago with the NIST, control saying you should limit, like the unsuccessful login control was put a limit in place and then lock the account if that limit's reached. That's a specific control. But what kind of control is that? Well, it could be a rule-based control, right? A procedure. You have a procedure. Users only allowed 3 logins, and then the account should be locked. Okay, well, that's true. But that account lock part is usually a technical control. You've implemented that on your network, right? It's not like I'm going to try 3 times and just stop. If I'm a hacker, you're going to have to make me. So you're going to have to put in place a technical control, a policy like a Windows networking group policy or SSH, login maximum, things like that. So that in effect, when that control is violated, when we try that 4th time to log in with a bad password, then it locks the account. So we have technical controls, administrative controls, we have procedural controls, we have physical controls like locks. We can't forget about things like that. I don't know how many times I got to do a pen test and I can finagle my way right into the server room and then right into a server because there's no locks anywhere, or they're very crappy locks, little spinny, locks that only have basically 1,000 combinations. Give me a few moments, I can get into one of those. So, but we want cameras, we want layers, and we want to think about these things. Well, then in addition, there's also kind of a classification scheme for controls, if you will. When do they act? So we have things like preventative controls. Well, technically, having an acceptable use policy, it's a policy control. It's a piece of paper somebody signs, but it's meant to be preventative. It's meant to tell that new employee, you can't do these things. We don't want to take these risks. So you signed off. And the idea being, if they violate it, then of course we can give them a warning and let them go. But we probably want to back those preventative controls and policy controls with technology. Like, well, some people say, well, if you have a rule that says you're not supposed to go there, why would you? Well, that's good, right? And that's good. And I probably want to do that, but I probably want to stick a web filter and filter the traffic. So in other words, I block access. If my rule says you can't go to Facebook, I want to block it. So even when you try to violate my rule, I'm still there. So that's layered defenses, right? You see how this all starts to come together. So what we're doing in cybersecurity is putting in place controls that are all of these different types, and we're putting multiple controls in from multiple sources. We've looked at multiple frameworks and we've gotten ideas for rules and procedures and policies, and we've brought them all together and we've implemented them in our company so that we can try to defend its core data and assets, and of course protect, keep our promises of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So how do we do this? I mean, yeah, okay, we've got some guidelines, some templates to look at. We can just use them all. Or how do we make a decision, for example, of Do we make the max login 3 attempts or 5 attempts? Well, remember in the first of the lesson, we talked about how there's an inverse relationship between security and convenience. When you increase security, then you decrease convenience. If you put 6 locks on your door, that's technically more secure, but you got to spend the time to open all 6 locks before you can get in your house. So every company is having to make that trade-off. They're having to decide how often, because if you say one password failure locks the account, then your support people are pissed off because they're having to unlock accounts all day because somebody just mistyped it. So nobody uses that number. 3 is pretty common, but maybe somebody is, happens fairly often. How do you decide? Do I use 1, 3, 5? And how do I decide, what level of, technology, how much protection is Amazon versus I going to put on my little pizza restaurant? Well, we have a concept called risk management. And when you really get down to it, at its heart, a lot of what we do in cybersecurity is all about risk management. We are trying to manage the risk that X happens. We're managing the risk that a hacker gets in and steals our critical data. We're managing the risk that somebody can take us offline and take us out. We're managing the risk that that hurricane comes and takes us offline and takes us out. So how do we deal with that? Well, we have to do a basically risk assessment in one form or fashion. And as the lesson talks about, there are ultimately 2 different types of risk assessments you can do. You can do what we call a qualitative, just a quality based. It's really kind of a scientific wild ass guess, but it's supposed to be logically thought through. Or we can do what we call a quantitative risk assessment, where we really put numbers to it. So initially, let's talk about just the qualitative one. So here we got our websites. Okay, remember from our definitions, we face a risk where a vulnerability and a threat come together, right? That's where a risk happens. So we both have websites, and websites can be vulnerable, web servers, websites, the code on them. So we technically, potentially have a vulnerability. And we know there's plenty of people out there, even just in this first class, and you knew it probably before you started this program. There are lots of people out there that attack websites all day, every day. So we obviously have the threat. So if we run our web server, Amazon and Lee's Pizza, we both have that risk that somebody could breach in, somebody could attack our website. We have the possible vulnerability on our website, or the vulnerable system in this case, a website, and we have attackers out there to potentially take advantage of it. So what do we do? Why is it that Amazon was willing to spend so much more, and on the other hand, we're not at Lee's Pizza? Well, it comes down to the risk assessment that we've done. If we just do a qualitative risk assessment, what you're generally doing is you're going to rank the risk in question, say on a very simple scale, low, medium, high. And you're also going to rank the impact of that. So what are the odds, low, medium, or high? And it's, based on knowledge and history and expert opinion, you can ask around, right, of a web attack. Well, the odds are pretty darn high of a web attack for both of us. We both have the same risk in the sense that it could happen. Now, theirs is probably even higher because they're a bigger target, but taking that out for a moment, we both have websites. They make a lot more money and we don't, but we both have a website and there's plenty of web attackers. And so there's a high risk that there's going to be a web attack. So we both mark and put that down on our paper on our risk assessment. Now, Amazon, though, if their web server goes down, they're losing gazillions of bucks a second. So the impact of that high risk happening would be high, maybe exceedingly high. But for us, half the day, we don't get many orders. It's only at night we get some delivery orders, we make a few $100. I mean, that's an impact. Maybe we'd even make it for my small company medium. Maybe it's a high impact, but it's just, once we do the math of it, it's not going to be as much. And actually that kind of shows, Amazon could rank high risk and high impact, and I might, even though it's only $100, that's a lot of money to me. So that's a high risk and a high impact. So, but how does that's better than nothing if you go around and you rank all your risk. I have an email server, I have a web server, we have remote access. What are the risks? What are the impacts? But what really is more powerful, and if nothing else, do a qualitative one, kind of gut it out. I can't help. I walk around places and I'm doing assessments of them effectively. Like I can see their cameras. Oh, but that doesn't seem to cover that area. And I'm taking an impact and making my own assessments. It's just kind of just the way I look at things now. But what the ideal way to do a risk analysis is to do it with numbers. So then all of a sudden, this is where this really comes out. Okay, we both have a high risk, and maybe Amazon's going to say it's 90%, maybe I'll rate it 80%. But then the impact, what's the impact? So much per hour, per second, per whatever, and it's way higher than my $200 a night. So, okay, that's going to tell Amazon they really got to put a lot of controls and a lot of protection and a lot of backup and a lot of redundancy in their systems so that they do not go down. Because if they go down, the costs are extraordinary. For me, I'm going to not spend much money. I'm going to make sure I have a copy of my website, not just up there in the cloud on whoever my host is, but I'm going to have it backed up, so that if you do take my site down, I can restore it and get back up. And, maybe a night or two, I don't get those couple $100, and that stinks, but it's not going to kill me. And I'm not going to spend $10,000 to fix a $200 problem. Amazon's going to spend tens of thousands, tens of millions to fix what is, potentially $1 billion problem for them. So risk assessment is huge. The reason we do it is because at the end of the day, we all face risk as people. We do it subconsciously without thinking about it all the time. But the reality is you only have so many things you can do with risk. You can avoid it, right? So like Lee's Pizza could take its website offline. Now there's still threats out there, web hackers, but I don't have a website, so I don't have a risk at all. I've avoided it. That's one way to do it, but I'd lose $200 a night. And Amazon's not going to do that. Their whole model is, the web. So then of course you can transfer the risk. That's what we do with insurance. Both businesses and companies, individuals, right? We buy insurance to transfer the risk. We buy car insurance in case we get into an accident, and we pay so much so that if it does happen, God forbid, that money comes in to repair the car or pay for medical care or whatever. So we can transfer the risk. That's one of the things that is happening, is one of the reasons why people are moving away from, in some cases, running their own stuff in-house to moving it up to the cloud. Because we now can let the cloud provider deal with some of that risk, right? We can mitigate the risk. And that's really where we come in cybersecurity. That's our job. We know we both have a web at risk, the big company and Little Lee's Pizza. So we need to put in controls in place. In my case, it's just a backup. But in their case, it's intrusion detection and a whole team of people watching it 24/7 and data centers all over the country. So if one goes down, they can shout, they are going to put that much into it because they want to mitigate that risk. They want to lower it, if not eliminate it, as much as possible. And the only other thing you can do is just accept the risk. We all get up every morning and we go about our day, despite the fact that, thankfully they are fairly rare, but, that we could be struck by a bus or something. We just take that risk. We go on. Now, and so those are the things we do. Those are the things we can do with risk, and we are going to determine based on risk analysis what we will do, and it will guide us to do it. Now, this then, of course, leads into the last couple topics I'll have to hit on pretty quickly. They're pretty straightforward, so I'll leave you to read them in the lesson. But this is all about, at the end of the day, as I said, we don't do cybersecurity in a vacuum. We do it to enable our organization to succeed. If that's a nonprofit, they're going to accomplish their mission. If it's a for-profit business, they're going to sell widgets, they're going to do whatever. Our job is to make sure that the data that makes that happen is available, confidential, and integrity is maintained. And we're going to enable our organization to succeed. But we have to be prepared in cybersecurity as part of that availability promise we make to help with what's called business continuity. We have to maintain the business if the breach does happen. We have to get that data back up. We have to prepare for that. If the hurricane comes in, what is our plan? And so in cybersecurity, a big part of what we do is we will do business impact analysis, which is where you take a risk assessment and then you really do carry it all the way down to numbers so that you can say, if we go offline or if this system goes away, and then by doing the risk assessment and doing the business impact analysis, what is the impact if our website goes down? What is the impact if somebody breaches our systems? What is the impact if somebody gets into our database? And then we calculate that, and that's going to help us decide how to protect it, how much we can afford to protect it, what kind of resources we want to throw, because we want to fix those big impacts. We want to mitigate them and make this as least likely as possible. But given that we pretty much have to adopt in this modern age that sooner or later something's going to happen, a breach or a natural disaster or something, we have to plan for that. That's all part of business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. And that we put into place depending upon. So once again, if Lee's Pizza, goes down because of power goes off from a natural disaster or hurricane, earthquake, whatever for a while, my little couple $100 a day is not really my bigger problem. It's not make or break. Getting my business back up, getting stuff in, getting supplies, power, maybe having a generator so I can open early, start making money again. That's important. So I plan that way. Amazon, on the other hand, they can't let the excuse of an earthquake or a natural disaster in one part of the world shut their whole operation down. So they have data centers all over the world. And even major, international companies do the same thing. Hey, our main facilities in Florida, we better have a site somewhere on the other side of the country. So in case that earthquake comes, we can send people there, we can bring everything up, and we can get back up and running as quick as possible. And so business impact analysis and risk assessment help us decide how to do that, how to plan for that. And ultimately, they enlighten everything we do when it comes to what kind of controls we're going to put in place, what kind of policies we're going to put in place, the things we're going to do to protect that corporate information and that cybersecurity promises we make. And so that's it. We don't have any student visitors today in our class, so I'm going to go ahead and shut down. And as always, it takes a little bit to process, upload, download, and get up into Zoom. But later today, tonight, sometime when I get a chance, I'll get it all done. When Zoom's done, we'll get it up there, and the links will be in the system. And we'll see you next time.